There is someone in your life, maybe a parent, a partner, a colleague, maybe someone you love deeply, who has never once looked you in the eye and said those two words, "I'm sorry." Not really. Not in a way that meant anything. And somehow, inexplicably, you ended up apologizing to them for being hurt, for bringing it up, for existing in the aftermath of what they did. This video is about why that happens, and what it tells us about the human mind at its most defended. The architecture of the non-apology. Most people assume that someone who never apologizes is simply arrogant, selfish, cruel, and sometimes that's true, but the psychology runs much deeper than that, because for certain people, an apology is not just an admission of a mistake, it is an existential threat. Psychologist Jennifer Robbins described it simply. Apologizing requires you to hold two things at once: that you did something wrong, and that you are still fundamentally okay as a person. For most of us, that's uncomfortable but manageable. For others, it's impossible, because their entire sense of self cannot survive the admission of fault. This is what researchers call a fragile high self-esteem. It looks like confidence. It presents as certainty. But underneath, it is glass. And an apology, real, genuine, accountable, would shatter it. So instead, the mind builds walls. It deflects, it rewrites, it attacks, not out of malice necessarily, out of survival. The narcissistic wound. In clinical psychology, there is a concept called narcissistic injury. It refers to the destabilizing threat that criticism or blame poses to someone with a deeply fragile sense of self. The term comes from Freud, but it was researchers like Heinz Kohut who mapped it properly. Kohut argued that narcissism, the defensive, brittle kind, develops when a child's emotional needs for mirroring, for being truly seen and validated, go unmet. The self that emerges is not solid, it is constructed, and it requires constant external reinforcement to stay intact. When you ask someone like this to apologize, you are not just asking them to say words, you are asking them to crack the foundation they built their identity on. To say I was wrong is to say I am flawed. And for a self that is already uncertain of its own worth, that is not a momentary discomfort. It is an annihilation. So the brain protects itself, automatically, immediately. The four defenses that people who never apologize tend to cycle through. Researchers studying interpersonal conflict have documented these patterns across cultures. They are so consistent, so predictable, that once you see them, you cannot unsee them. The first is denial. It simply did not happen the way you think it happened. Your memory is wrong. You are being dramatic. You are too sensitive. This is gaslighting in its purest form, not necessarily a calculated manipulation, but a psychological necessity. The mind genuinely rewrites events to protect the self. The second is minimization. Okay, maybe it happened, but it was not a big deal. You are overreacting. Other people have it worse. Why do you always make everything so serious? The harm is acknowledged just enough to seem reasonable, but stripped of its weight. The wound becomes your problem for feeling it. The third is counterattack. You want me to apologize. What about what you did? What about 3 years ago? What about the way you spoke to me last Tuesday? This is deflection weaponized. It turns the conversation into a court case where suddenly you are the defendant. Researcher John Gottman, whose decades of couples research at the University of Washington became foundational in relationship psychology, called this pattern defensiveness, one of the 4 horsemen of relationship breakdown. He found it present in nearly every relationship headed for collapse. The fourth is the non-apology apology. I'm sorry you feel that way. I'm sorry if you were hurt. I'm sorry, but you have to understand where I was coming from. These sentences contain the architecture of an apology without any of its substance. They place the wound in your perception rather than their action. They are statements dressed in the costume of accountability. The shame beneath the surface. Here is the part that makes this genuinely tragic, and it is important to sit with this because it changes how you understand these people. Research by Brené Brown at the University of Houston, spanning over a decade of qualitative interviews, found a crucial distinction between guilt and shame. Guilt says I did something bad. Shame says I am bad. And people who cannot apologize are almost always drowning in the second, not the first. They are not unapologetic because they feel nothing. Many of them feel everything, but their shame is so total, so engulfing, that acknowledging a specific fault would open a door they cannot close. Because behind that door is not just this mistake, it is every mistake. It is the deep-seated belief that they are fundamentally defective, and once that door opens, they fear they will not survive what is behind it. Brown's research showed that the antidote to shame is empathy, connection, being seen in your imperfection and still accepted. But people with deep shame architecture often cannot receive that either, because receiving it requires vulnerability. And vulnerability is the one thing their entire psychological system has been designed to prevent. So they stay defended, and they keep hurting people, and they never understand why. What it does to you. Now let's talk about the other side. Because if you have spent years in close proximity to someone like this, something happens to you that you may not even have named yet. You start to doubt your own perception. When someone consistently reframes your experience, when your hurt is always the wrong response, your memory always inaccurate, your needs always excessive, your internal compass begins to drift. Psychologist Robin Stern, who developed the framework around gaslighting in modern psychology, documented what she called the gaslight effect, a gradual erosion of a person's trust in their own mind. It does not happen suddenly. It happens in the accumulation of 1,000 small moments where your reality was quietly replaced with theirs. And here is the deeply uncomfortable part. You may have started apologizing for things that were not your fault, for having feelings, for needing accountability, for existing in the space where their guilt should have lived. This is not weakness. This is adaptation. When the social environment around you makes accountability impossible, the psychologically flexible response, the survival response, is to absorb the dissonance yourself, to carry the weight they refuse to hold. The problem is that weight accumulates, and at some point, it becomes indistinguishable from self-blame. Can they change? The question people always ask. Can someone like this change? Can they learn? Can they arrive eventually at a real apology? The honest answer is that some do, but rarely without significant disruption. Research on personality change, particularly studies by Brent Roberts at the University of Illinois and his colleagues tracking personality across decades, shows that core traits can shift, but usually require what psychologists call identity-level confrontation, a loss, a rupture, a moment where the constructed self fails so completely that rebuilding it differently becomes the only option. Therapy can accelerate this. Specifically, approaches like schema therapy, developed by Jeffrey Young, which works at the level of early maladaptive patterns rather than surface behavior. But the person has to choose it, has to tolerate the discomfort of looking behind the door. Most do not, because the constructed self, fragile as it is, still feels safer than the unknown on the other side. What you cannot do is apologize them into growth. You cannot absorb enough of their discomfort to make accountability feel safe for them. That is not a failure of your love or your effort. It is a limit of how change works. The quiet truth at the end. There is something worth sitting with as we close. The person who cannot apologize is almost always someone who was never truly apologized to. Someone who grew up in an environment where accountability was dangerous, where admitting fault meant punishment or abandonment, where the self had to become armored just to survive. That does not excuse what they do. Explanation is not absolution, but it does reframe it. Because the cruelty that never says sorry is often the cruelty that was never apologized to for the wounds it carries. The cycle is long, and it is quiet, and most people living inside it have no idea they are in it at all. The question worth leaving with is not whether they will ever apologize. That may never come. The question is whether you are still waiting for it to feel okay about yourself. Whether you have quietly outsourced your own sense of worth to a verdict that may never arrive. Because that verdict, that you were worth an apology, does not require their delivery to be true. It already is.